A hostage development is first tonight. A group called the Islamic Jihad for the Liberation of Palestine said today it would release an American hostage in 48 hours. It holds 3 American university professors, Robert Polhill, Alan Steen, and Jesse Turner. A picture of Turner came with today's announcement in Beirut. The kidnapper's statement said U.S. Assistant Secretary of State John Kelly should fly to Damascus, Syria for the release. The White House said it would welcome the release of any hostage. We get 3 perspectives now on this story. From Joseph Sisko, former Undersecretary of State who handled Middle East affairs in the State Department for many years. He's now a consultant. Shireen Hunter, Deputy Director of Middle East Studies at the Center for Strategic and International Studies in Washington, and a former diplomat in the Iranian Foreign Service. And Martin Kramer of the Diane Center for Middle East Studies in Israel and author of a book about the Hezbollah movement in Lebanon. He's now a fellow at the Woodrow Wilson Center here in Washington. To you first, Mr. Kramer. First, tell us about the Islamic Jihad for the Liberation of Palestine. Who are they and what do they want?
The Islamic Jihad for the Liberation of Palestine made its first appearance in January 1987 with the kidnapping of the Americans, the 3 Americans that you mentioned earlier. It made as its immediate demand the release of 400 persons detained by Israel or by the Israeli-backed South Lebanon Army, 310 Shiites and 90 Palestinians. It is not considered to be a Palestinian group. The consensus is that it is predominantly Shiite and is closely allied to Iran.
Have they done anything other than take these 3 hostages?
No, they have not.
And we've not heard of them in any other context?
They've occasionally issued threats from time to time that they would take this or that action. In fact, recently they were the ones behind the threat against the Hungarians who were allowing Soviet Jewish immigrants to leave Hungary for Israel. But aside from threats, they've never been responsible for any terrorist act.
All right, now, for context purposes, they hold 3 of the 8 Americans. Now, who holds the other 5, just so we'll understand?
There is another group which goes by the name of Islamic Jihad and which is the most veteran of the hostage-holding groups. It holds 2, Terry Anderson and Thomas Sutherland, and the demands of that group have always been connected with the release of Shiites who are held in Kuwait. A second group, or cluster of hostages, is held by the Revolutionary Justice Organization. There are 2 or perhaps 3, we're not sure. And in their case, although they've occasionally made demands, their demands have never been systematic, and it seems to be that they have a general philosophy that the holding of hostages keeps the enemies of Hezbollah and of the captors themselves at bay. They have no systematic demands for release. They only threaten to execute their hostages from time to time.
Now, is there any connection, any discernible connection that we know of, or the outside world knows of, between these 3, among these 3 organizations?
We believe that from time to time there is perhaps cooperation between the different groups. Certainly they are all associated in one way or another with the umbrella movement of Hezbollah. There have been reports in past instances that hostages held under one name have in fact seen or come into contact with hostages held under another. But basically each of the groups represents a different logic for holding hostages, and those logics are quite distinct.
Ms. Hunter, would you agree with Mr. Kramer that this group we're talking about, the Islamic Jihad for the Liberation of Palestine, is as an Iranian organization for all practical purposes?
Well, I really don't think that one can say that any of these groups are exactly the same, have the same objectives, or that they are completely under the control or influence of their sponsors. It seems to me that the experience in the last years have shown that even though obviously they are responsive to the countries that have sponsored them over the years, that they also have their own agenda. But it seems that, however, that at least this group, if depending on how everything evolves, that it seems that they are indeed perhaps quite sensitive to the views coming from Tehran. But I don't think that one can say that Tehran is just pulling the strings.
Do you know, in other words, you shouldn't, if anybody wanted to give credit for this announcement today, assuming that it eventually comes off and the hostage is released, that nobody should be giving any kind of credit to the Iranians? You don't think they have that kind of power?
Well, I think that they have a significant amount of influence, but there is a difference between influence and actually having the power of ordering them, release or not release. And I don't know whether one can actually give credit to people that helped
Sure.
release hostage, because I mean, taking them was already a discredited action. But I think that it is safe to assume that probably Iran has also played some role in this regard.
Mr. Cisco, is this statement today something that should be taken seriously?
It's a very credible one, in my judgment, Jim. The reason is it's devoid of anti-American rhetoric. I don't read the release in 48 hours with a preconditionality. In other words, they have talked about Kelly going, but I don't think that's the sine qua non. From the Bush administration point of view, we couldn't get the assistant secretary in that kind of a bargaining situation, for one, when so many other hostages need to be released. If there's anybody that has to go and coordinate the release, the Red Cross can do the job very easily.
Yeah. So but you don't read the statement as if Kelly doesn't come, this hostage is not going to be released.
I do not. And I assume, Jim, that something has occurred before this, and hopefully something will occur afterward. And by that I mean, there's been a lot of activity in the last 3 or 4 weeks through the quiet confines of diplomatic channels. I think we can very easily signal a willingness to continue the dialogue indirectly once this hostage is released unconditionally, and the way we've been doing it, largely through third parties and by other means for the time being.
Meaning, let's say that within the 48 hours a hostage is released, that then the United States takes some action?
No, I think that in the context of this release, we can make it clear through all sorts of other sources that we're willing to talk, not bargain, but we're willing to carry on a dialogue. And I'm struck with the fact that if you examine the statement very carefully, there's reference to Iran, there's reference to Syria. I think they're both involved, as well as the Shiites on the ground who have their own interests. Jim, hostage holding is just not consistent with the overall global environment. And above all, the holders haven't really gotten anything from holding on to the hostages.
But wouldn't they want something now, Ms. Hunter, if they're going to give them up?
Well, I think that if everybody wants something eventually, the question is that when they're going to get it, and whether they want to get something immediately, whether they want to get an assurance that, a rather firm assurance that once the whole hostage file, so to speak, is closed, that there is going to be some kind of not exactly quid pro quo, but certain consequences of this act. But I think that I tend, nevertheless, to agree also with Joe Cisco that in general, the whole international and regional environment is really against hostage holding and hostage taking. Now, this may be that the process is still, for getting everybody released, may be a lengthy one, but I'm hopeful that hopefully this is the year that we're going to get everybody out.
But isn't there a problem here in that what Iran wants maybe is one thing, maybe what Syria wants is another thing, maybe, and what the holders of the hostages may be an entirely different thing?
That certainly is the case. But what I am, a bit more encouraged, actually, and that is that in the past, I would say that several months, there has been a greater coordination, it seems to me, between Iran and Syria. And I think that both states, it seems to me that they have reached a point that Lebanon, and particularly all these hostage problems, have become really a burden, and that it not only it's not an asset, but rather it is really a liability. And I think in that sense, obviously, this is a very positive thing. However, as far as the groups are concerned, and I think that Martin Kramer mentioned, probably they're going to have also some demands. Some of them may have much less noble, or whether one can call it noble, but purposes, including perhaps some financial payoff in this regard. Others are more difficult because, if there are question of relatives in jail and so forth. So
I was just going to ask, Mr. Kramer, can the holders of these hostages, not only these first three we've been talking about, the Islamic Jihad for the Liberation of Palestine, but the other ones as well, can they ever be satisfied?
Well, they have very specific demands, and if one reads their statements carefully, one sees them reiterated again and again. In this particular case, the demand regarding the release of the detainees has been a systematic one. And I think that is really their top priority. They look back to the 1985 TWA hijacking to Beirut, which resulted in the release of over 700 Shiite detainees held by Israel in return for the American passengers. I think that the difference and the sticking point with this group has been that 1985 is not 1990. In 1985, there were no Israelis held by any of the Shiite fundamentalist groups. Today, there are as many as 3 Israeli servicemen who are held by Hezbollah, and the sticking point has been that Israel's position is that they should be included in any comprehensive trade involving the detainees, which would include perhaps Sheikh Abdul Karim Ubaid, who was abducted by the Israelis last summer.
Well, what's your judgment, your overall judgment, Mr. Kramer? You've spent a lot of time particularly studying Hezbollah, the Islamic Jihad. Do you think this is the beginning of the end? I mean, do you think that, that you agree with Ms. Hunter that it's now in Iran and Syria's interest to get this thing behind them?
Well, I would definitely agree with Ms. Hunter regarding the Iranian interest in putting this behind Iran. I think, in particular, President Rafsanjani has an agenda which he wishes to get to, and that agenda requires that he put this behind him. My sense is nonetheless that it's more an incremental advance. The fact is that in order to stay in business, in the hostage-holding business, you need only 2 hostages. Islamic Jihad itself, that holds Sutherland and Anderson, is down to 2, and it has never gone below that because the 2 are held in order to meet its own demands. In this case, Islamic Jihad for the Liberation of Palestine had 3. It may give up 1. In any case, it will still have 2 in which to pursue its own demands, and those will be very hard to meet and would have to be met within the context of a very comprehensive negotiation involving Israel, the United States, Iran, the hostage holders, perhaps Syria.
So the Islamic Jihad for the Liberation of Palestine is not going to be terribly interested in whether or not Iran has an economic problem that could be solved by the release of the hostages, right?
Well, they want to be accommodating. There's no question about that. Other groups have taken and released hostages in the past in order to advance Iran's interest. But their position has always been that they must keep at least 2 in order to assure that their own demands, their own agenda is met.
How's that sound to you, Joe Cisco?
I agree with what Mr. Kramer's had to say. And at the end of the line, there's little doubt in my mind that they're going to want something in return. I think what's important is that in this ongoing dialogue that I've mentioned, that we make it clear that we understand the broader considerations that are involved. The reason why Syria and Iran are so involved right now is that there's a parallelism of interest between the 2. They're both very isolated in the area. Soviet Union and the United States, if we should ease tensions in the Middle East, they're less a strategic asset, if they ever were a strategic asset in the area. And therefore, I believe that hopefully it's the beginning of the process without getting unduly optimistic, but it's a long road ahead.
Long road. You agree, Ms. Hunter?
I agree that it's a long road, yes.
Yeah. Well, Ms. Hunter, Mr. Kramer, Mr. Cisco, thank you all 3 very much.
Still ahead on the NewsHour, Charlene Hunter-Gault on